if we zoom out the lens and look at the history and what's the biggest change that's happened in our lifetimes, it's really this digital transformation that we've undergone. Everything from how we date to how we eat to how we work to how we relax to how we exercise, everything has been completely changed by the digitization.
Hello and welcome to Art Goes On, a podcast featuring art people on how they keep the art world running. Here they will share their vision of the present and a glimpse of the future. I'm your host, Pierre de Montesquieu, recording from Paris, France, so please pardon my English. Before we start, as we try to make this show interactive, here's a quick reminder to follow our Instagram account at AskArtGoesOn, where you'll be able to ask questions to upcoming guests. Now, on to today's show. Today I'm happy to welcome Jason Bailey, who runs Artnome.com, a blog where you will learn everything on the art world through the lens of digital, artificial intelligence, data, blockchain, and so on. Hi, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pierre. Excited, with everybody stuck in their homes, it's exciting to have the opportunity to talk to somebody about the subjects that I love. I love my wife and I love my dog, but I'm ready to talk to some other humans.
Good for us. So, Jason, how art is going for you?
It's good. It's interesting when a crisis like the pandemic hits. In some ways we need art more than ever, but how we interface with art has to change a little bit. So for me, my whole life, since I was a very little kid, I regularly, every few months go to the museum, and it's where I get my therapy. My blood pressure goes down. It's my connection to history, it makes me feel like I'm part of something larger. All the crazy people throughout history with the most interesting ideas, the work that they created ends up in these museums. And one of the biggest things that's been hard for me is to not be able to go to museums. There were a few things, that I had lined up that got canceled. So I was supposed to present at South by Southwest, the big conference in Texas. I think that was the first thing that I had set up that was canceled, and I had booked my hotel and my plane, and I thought, well, this will be quick and then we'll be back to normal. And then a month later, I had a presentation at the International Society of Appraisers that was canceled in Denver, and I was excited to go see that, but that was canceled. And then I was curating a show tentatively with a publisher in Montreal called Antiism. And I had reached out to a bunch of artists and was going to work with Kate Voss Gallery. And we ultimately decided that had to cancel. So, I was a little bit sad on all those fronts, but then, art goes on, as you say. And, I found other ways to engage. So now I'm working on a show again with Kate Voss Gallery that'll be online that focuses more on generative art, which is digital. So it's easier to do online. And I've had some great opportunities this year. I wrote the cover story for Art in America in January on generative art. I think it's a great sign that the traditional art world is starting to embrace some of this art that I love so much. And then just a week or two ago, I published a paper on using machine learning for the valuation of art and predicting prices for art with Harvard and MIT Press. So, I've just shifted the way I engage a bit more towards writing and things like podcasts and away from traveling. And it's not so bad now that I'm used to it. I've been able to find ways to engage thanks to the rich community and folks like yourself that reach out.
I'm curious about your background, because art and tech don't often match, or only recently. Could you tell us more about your story?
Ever since I was very, very little, all I've ever wanted to do was to be an artist. They were my heroes when I was very young. It's been consistent through my whole life. But I grew up in a family entirely of engineers. So it doesn't mean that engineers don't love art. I get my love of art partially from my dad, who is an engineer, but my father was an engineer. My older brother is an engineer, and my younger brother is an engineer. So what people think, I think they think I'm joking or exaggerating, but literally every single conversation, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 18 years was about the latest technology and, math and things that I was not particularly good at. I think part of it is I didn't think I was good at those things because that was really their specialty and it wasn't what I was great at. So I learned to listen most of the time and ask questions and try not to ask dumb questions because it wasn't, that wasn't my passion or my area. But you can't help but growing up in that environment without actually learning a whole lot, right? So I would go off on my own, sort of an introvert, and spend lots of time drawing and painting and writing and reading, but was surrounded by this technical environment. So I got my undergraduate degree focusing on painting and sculpture and printmaking and studio art and art history, and thought that I would teach. And then I realized I was going to teach high school, and I realized I didn't want to be back in that environment. I hadn't really enjoyed it the first time around. So I needed a job, like lots of people with art degrees, and I ended up getting a job through a connection through my father at a technical medical product development company. And my job was to interview the engineers and help make videos and help do graphics and things like that. And I realized that by listening to technical people talk for, my whole life growing up and having to ask questions without being embarrassed and simplify and break things down, that's actually a very valuable skill. So I for my full-time day job for the last 20 years, I've worked in sort of design and marketing and at cutting edge companies that work with machine learning and data analysis. And I can listen to and talk to some of the smartest folks in the world and patiently ask questions and kind of translate their ideas without losing the sophistication of their ideas into a format that other people can understand. So that's sort of my day job, but it also changed the kind of art that I made. I went back and got my master's degree, my MFA, 10 years after getting into the work world, and really dove into generative art and the intersection of art and tech, and started making my own work, but also just grew an appreciation for generative art. And yeah, that's how I've ended up sort of this hybrid world. Most people I know start in math and move to art, or start in engineering and move to art. And I was kind of the other way around.
And indeed, I think that Artnome is the most articulated information source about this field. But the general public and even a large part of the art world are still confused about it. Generative art was born maybe in the 50s or 60s, but today everyone is talking about AI and crypto art. Could you please enlighten us about those different notions?
So I think in the late 50s, early 60s, we started seeing people in computer labs using, computers were hard to get to. They could fill rooms, and getting time on them, you had to wait in line, and people would use them for very serious things like, for military purposes or, for big companies. But a few people managed to get in and start creating artworks that were sort of geometric based kind of artworks. So people like Georg Nies and later on Vera Molnar and Michael Knoll. It couldn't be popular because their computers weren't popular yet. Not that many people had access to computers, right, and couldn't really understand it. And really, artists in a traditional art world, even though artists are usually the first people to embrace new things and new ideas, and that's an important role, when it comes to tech, they tend to be a little bit more afraid. And I think it's often we fear what we don't understand, and they worry, are these robots or is this tech going to replace artists? So it was a very slow start through the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? The art world, arguably even now, has been very slow to embrace. But with every new technology that comes out, what artists can do changes and expands. So while AI has been around also, I might get this wrong, but I think at least since the 50s, it comes and goes in waves. So there's a thing called the AI winter where there's too much hype and then it kind of pulls away. And then there's too much hype and then it pulls away. And we just recently went through a phase where machine learning in particular, right, which is this process of a subset of AI where we teach machines by feeding them a lot of information and having them learn and then create an output that is based on those learnings. has become really popular. So artists are doing things with machine learning using GANs, and I won't go super technical, but people can look up GANs. They're generative adversarial networks. And in the last 2 or 3 years, when people get really excited about what they're calling AI art, what they really mean is machine learning art. And what they really mean when they say machine learning art is art made with GANs. Yes, there is more work being done, arguably even more interesting work being done in other areas, but everything you see in the news is mostly around GANs. I've decided that work done with machine learning and AI is a subset of generative art. When I write about it, it's generative art to me is any artwork where there's a certain amount of randomness introduced, and the artist is writing a program that produces the output. And while the GANs and machine learning are a new form of that, I think they still fit my loose definition. Now, going back to how new technologies produce new opportunities for artists, completely separate from generative art, blockchain became really popular in the last 5 or 6 years, maybe 3 or 4 years for the art world. And I think the art world has this need every year to have something new to write about and talk about. And when I say that, people think I'm being insulting, but I'm not. I think we all have a need every year. I get bored of things too. We all have a need every year to do something new. So 2 or 3 years ago, I think the art world sort of latched on to this idea of blockchain and what could it mean for the art world. And prior to that, there was more of an underground arts movement. So there was cryptocurrency like Bitcoin and Ethereum that people may be familiar with, are currencies that are provably rare and usable because they're limited and distributed. So anybody can go and look and see how much has been produced. So this allows people to use cryptocurrencies online like a regular currency. The art market and the art world became interested and kind of latched onto this. But prior, it was really a group of folks that were interested in cryptocurrencies that were producing artworks. That the idea of decentralization is that because you can have a smart contract that or a program that can execute without human interference, you don't necessarily have to have an intermediary. So with currency, the way that works is you can cut out the banks, which people like because they think, well, in the past, when things go bad, the banks can shut down. Or if the government's in charge of the currency, the government can print more money. But if you have a smart contract in place and it's decentralized, you don't have to worry about what we would call the middleman. So what they thought would happen in art is that this would do away with like gallerists and people like in museums and auction houses, and the artists would get all the money because it would be decentralized. And there's a lot of really cool things that came out of blockchain and crypto art, a whole movement of people that are motivated by this technology, but also by this idea that, we could change the art world and make it more decentralized. And instead of having just a small number of very wealthy collectors supporting just a small number of artists who seem like the superstar artists, maybe we can have a broader, healthier distribution with lots of collectors and lots of artists, and nobody can say which artists can show and which ones can't. So this was all the vision. But it turns out just putting your artwork on the blockchain or tokenizing it doesn't mean people will come and buy it, right? And I think that was the mistake that a lot of people made. They assumed that there was some magical formula about now that it's tokenized, even though no one was interested in my artwork before, maybe now people will come running and want to buy it because it's tokenized, and that's not been the case. Where it has been healthy and helpful, I think, is for provenance, right? So it's a tamper-proof system for provenance. So as people create and launch these artworks on the blockchain, you can tell who made them, and if anything's been changed, and you can prove that you own them. And that combined with digital scarcity, which is really the most important part of the blockchain. For years when people made digital art, part of the reason I think it was slow to become popular in the art world was that if I make a JPEG and put it on Twitter and you can see it and everyone can see it for free, why would you give me money for that JPEG, right? And if you're thinking like a traditional collector, well, using the same principles that allow you to know that every Bitcoin is unique so that you can use it for a currency, we're able to transfer that same thinking to art and say, okay, there's a token that backs each of these artworks and it's provably rare, the token is, and you can tie that token to an image of the artwork that's stored decentrally, which means that no one person can necessarily take it down. which gives a lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people enough faith to start participating in this new crypto art market, right? So where generative art is using computers to produce art with programs, and there's sort of this back and forth on some randomness, some really complex artwork can come out of it using some fairly simple and elegant code, right? It's an aesthetic. In the early generative art, you see sort of this geometric aesthetic. And then now with the more machine learning oriented art, there's, sort of this Francis Bacon look that people might be familiar with, scary, mushy faces, right? That's the generative art side. The blockchain side is really a new technology that people are using, decentralized database that people are using initially for commerce, and now for its properties around digital scarcity to see if we can evolve a new crypto art market, right, where the artists have a bit more freedom. So the two are a little bit separate, but you certainly have examples of artists that are doing generative art and tokenizing it and offering it on the blockchain.
And generative art can be physical and not only seen on screens or computers.
Yeah, it can. Actually, I'll be in a little bit over my head, but before we had digital computers, I believe we had things that were considered like physical computers. So there was a famous artist whose name I'm going to forget, but he adapted a World War II bomb site computer. And it's a physical machine, but it can compute, right? And he used it to create these really terrific drawings. It's something sort of poetic about adapting a machine designed to drop bombs on people to create art instead and create new things. But I think it's programmatic or systematic, production of artworks that include some degree of randomness or pseudo-randomness. So people that are far more technical than I am get angry at my looser, high-level definitions, and they'll give you like a book-length long dissertation on what the definition is. But I think if we ever want to get the general population to get excited about generative art, we need to be a little bit kinder and simpler in our definitions.
Yes, it's still a niche within the contemporary art. Do you think that the lockdown is an opportunity to give it more visibility? Because with video and photography, it is the most screen-compliant art form.
I think there's a huge opportunity even before COVID. To me, I'm not surprised that the art world in particular is behind. I mean, I think art history well enough to know that art history is just a sequence of rebellions over and over and over again, right? So, people are in the salons, and then, people are upset about that. So they go off and, build out their own art shows. And even it's a series of renegades against renegades against renegades. Marcel Duchamp submits his urinal into a show of artists who are pretty forward-looking artists. They thought they were the renegades, and he was a renegade within the renegades, right? And then we get photography, and everyone says that's not art. And then the abstract expressionists go against photography by, the non-representational work. So there's, I didn't do it justice there, but I think everybody knows, even up to the 1980s with graffiti art, which no one accepts, and now everyone wants to buy and sell, right? So I look at the cold reception that generative art and computer-based art in general has received in the last 20, 30 years. And the signs that it's been rejected as heavily as it has tells me that it's probably a really good chance that it'll be considered canonized and considered very important in the future. It's usually the work that people push back on the most that becomes the most important. And then, I say this a lot when I talk to folks, and it's because I mean it. I actually think generative artists are the most important artists of our generation. And the reason I say that is because if you look at what's the most important thing in your lifetime, in my lifetime, if we zoom out the lens and look at the history, right? And what's the biggest change that's happened in our lifetimes? It's really this digital transformation that we've undergone, right? Everything from how we date to how we eat, to how we work, to how we relax, to how we exercise, to, everything has been completely changed by the digitization in computers and the internet. But it feels, because we've lived through it, it's hard to realize just how abrupt and how much things have changed. So if you fast forward and you look at, well, what's the important art from our generation? It's going to be the art, in my opinion, that uses the tools of our time, right? That uses computation, not just computers, because you can use a computer like a paintbrush, right? But art that uses computation itself and programs, right? And uses those things to think about at a deeper level, how are those tools changing the rest of our life, right? So, using AI to create art, thinking about what AI could do to, or already is doing to the way that we live, right? And uh, for those reasons, I suspect that all of these artists are sort of dramatically undervalued today. And the rest of my speech, sort of on my soapbox, again, if we look at our art history, we've always done a pretty lousy job of celebrating the geniuses, and waiting until they were dead, which I think is unfortunate. And if we look back at that pattern and say, okay, we have brilliant people like Vera Molnar, who's in her 90s, right? And she's like a pioneer of generative art. Here's our chance to actually celebrate a genius, while she's alive, who's making some of the most important work that's of our generation. So we'll see. I think that we're seeing some small changes. A lot of museums are doing shows around generative art and AI art, things like that. And, maybe it'll take hold. I have confidence in the long run that will be the work that shines. I don't think someone will look back 20, 30, 40 years from now and say, wow, this person had a new painting technique, on canvas or something like that. I think it's going to be something around digital.
If we compare it to photography that took almost 100 years to be recognized as an art form, and also because of the dealers who started to open photo galleries in the 80s and started to build a market, what is the landscape of the AI or generative art galleries or market? Also considering what you've said about the fact that some crypto artists wanted to shortcut the dealers.
So this is where I think there's a lot of potential for generative art and crypto art to dovetail. There are two things that are interesting to me, but it turns out that a lot of generative artists, traditional generative artists, they don't necessarily, in the Venn diagram, they don't necessarily overlap with sort of the revolutionary crowd that are excited about the social potential of blockchain. Sometimes they do, but not all that often. So I run into, in the early days, I would go to some generative artists I know and like and say, hey, blockchain's really a great way, tokenizing work and blockchain's really a great way for me to support you and collect your work. Would you be interested in doing this? And sometimes they do it. But for the most part, I think the generative artists still want their shot to be recognized by the traditional art world, the brick and mortar galleries and the museums. And those are the things they grew up wanting. And they don't necessarily want to jump past that and go into building this new crypto art world. I wish they did. And I think it'd be great if more of them wanted to. But to be honest, I think they want traditional success. Now, on the other side, are the crypto artists, who most of them aren't generative. They happen to use computers to make digital art, and some really great art in some cases. And their goal is more about upending this traditional art world and saying, that world is sort of broken, and let's do something new and different. Now, where I have faith that everything will kind of shift more towards digital and blockchain is when you look at the contrast between generations. So not just familiarity with computers, so you think about baby boomers versus someone from Gen Z or the millennials who grew up with computers from a very, very young age, right? So there's that side. But socially and culturally, at least in the US, and I think, true in most of, the world, there's the biggest gap in opinions, social opinions and political opinions between generations that I've ever seen, with Gen Z and boomers at each other's throats and not getting along, right? And when that happens, back to this idea of revolution and art, they're going to be very eager to do whatever it is that pisses off and drives the boomers crazy, the younger people, right? So the idea that, let's just take crypto art, for example, it's pretty difficult today just to get an account set up, just to figure out how to use crypto art to buy something, and then you're buying a JPEG that everybody else can see for free. Well, that drives boomers nuts. And I think younger folks actually like that there are some barriers set in place to make it harder for older folks to get into their world and get past the technical complexity of getting into collecting these things or whatever. And then I think the kinds of topics that are covered in the art that younger folks want today is very, very different from the art that older folks want. So I wonder, we're about to head into the greatest wealth transfer in the history of the world. That's a known thing because the boomers are a very large generation and they've acquired a lot of wealth through time periods that were relatively productive for them. But they'll be moving on and leaving money for the younger generations. And I wonder if the younger generations are going to want to collect the artists that were popular for the last 30, 40 years, or if they're going to want to do something intentionally very, very different to carve out their own direction.
And what about the galleries that are dealing this kind of art?
The markets are starting the shift towards the digital in two ways, top down and bottom up. So you look at like the Zwirner viewing rooms and things like that, right? That people are more familiar with in the traditional art world. And the older art world, more traditional art world, is always going to try to start by approximating something that they had that was successful in real life before, right? So they're going to show you a photo of a white cube with something that looks like a painting, even if it was created digitally on that wall, because that's where their bread and butter came from. That was their success, right? So with COVID, if everything's shut down, it doesn't really behoove them to start from scratch. They need to try to replicate what they had. And that's pretty normal and human. You think about when we swapped from books to the Kindle, we still wanted to hold something in our hand. We weren't ready to just get rid of something physical altogether. And now I think most people actually listen to audiobooks, and it doesn't really matter where the device is, right? Same with music. We had records and then cassettes and then CDs. And then it took us a while to get comfortable. You look at the iPod, we still needed something physical. And now we're comfortable with this idea that the music doesn't live anywhere, right? But there's this walking through. So I think the Zwirners and the blue chip galleries are trying to recreate what they're making the iPods. They're trying to recreate the physical world in the digital, which to me is not as exciting, but I understand if you're going to walk a large audience in that direction, you have to do it. From the bottom up, the crypto art world, people like Super Rare are building these galleries that are based fully on the blockchain and decentralized. I don't think they're trying to reproduce that world as much, although sometimes they do. There are debates that maybe the crypto art world is slowly starting to just replicate what we saw in the old world. But there's an opportunity when you have nothing to lose and you're starting from the bottom up to do things that are revolutionary. Super Rare can do revolutionary things that Zwirner can't, because Zwirner has to, continue their success, and Super Rare has less to lose, to be honest, right? So I'm a little bit more optimistic about the bottom-up approach than I am the top-down.
So is there a conflict or a division between traditional galleries or dealers and the new generation you've described? And do AI artists feel like artists or AI artists?
AI artists, the first step, they hate being called AI artists. I wrote about that a lot in the early days, so it's partially my fault. Again, it's easy to explain to people, but I think if anything, they would say computational artists or machine learning artists or generative artists. But it's this tension where they've been kept out of the club for a long time, right, of the high-end art world, blue chip art world. So they don't necessarily love the institutions that they feel like have kept them out, but at the same time, they would want acceptance because they know that globally, that's how we judge whether something's successful or not, right? So when Christie's first came out with the work by Obvious, I know some of the folks at Christie's that, helped start that. And we had the blockchain conference the spring before they had launched that. And they actually asked me to interview Obvious at their New York event. And I would have, but I wasn't able to attend. But the problem with that wasn't that Christie's is trying to embrace something new, like, machine learning. I actually applaud that. And I think it's great. It's that they didn't have anybody on staff that was qualified or trained in understanding how the work was made and how generative art is made and what the history of generative art is. And what is the business that Christie's is in? They're in the business of expertise. That's really all they sell is expertise. They don't make the work. They're just trusted as experts. In this particular area, again, which I applaud that they moved into, they don't have expertise. And most art people don't have expertise in this area because there's nothing in a traditional art education that would give you this background. So it's not an insult, it's just a reality, right? So I think that that's partially why that went wrong. That didn't help when they did that. It didn't help the image of the traditional art world to AI artists because they thought, well, these morons, they've gone off and done this thing and not given Robbie Barrett proper credit, and they can't even tell the good work from the bad, and they haven't bothered to think about how it was created and how the work was sourced and how people use each other's software. And it was such a surface level presentation of the work that some of these artists have been working on their whole lives, right? But at the same time, that doesn't mean that they don't want to have patrons and sell work and, have access to a world where the work sells for more. So yeah, there's a tension there.
Just to get back to this sales story and put it into context, Christie surprisingly sold the portrait of Edmond de Bellamy for more than $400,000. And there was a polemic because Obvious, the French art collective that made the artwork, used the algorithm of another artist, Robbie Barrett.
Yeah, that's right. And they didn't just use it. If you go onto GitHub, which is like a software repository where you can kind of talk back and forth, the artist whose work they used was a 18 or 19-year-old phenomenal artist who's sort of ahead of his years or whatever. And they were pressuring, almost bordering on almost like bullying, like, we need to finish this and you need to help us more and this, that, and the other. We need to. So it was easy to dislike them after reading those things. Although I've interviewed at least one of them, and I think you could do several podcasts on this. They're not bad people either. They didn't come from a traditional art background. They were trying to build a startup, and they saw the opportunity to kind of trick or fool people. They know that people are afraid of AI replacing jobs and taking over, right? And they thought, well, if we play up this idea that, the AI made the work and this, that, and the other, and then they kind of, when the traditional AI world, scientists and artists came back and said, wait, you're spreading information around the world because the story caught on, globally. You're spreading false information around the world about the capabilities of AI and ML. And as a researcher, why don't you use this opportunity to actually help people understand how things really work, right? So that was part of it too. So, but they didn't know from my interview with them that things would go as fast as they did. No one would have a reason to believe that. I understand that. They didn't know that all of a sudden Christie's was going to sell their work and it was going to sell for like, $400,000. They thought, well, this is fun, right? We're making a fun project and yeah, we want to sell it because we're young and we want money and, we can put it into our company. And then all of a sudden things went a little bit faster than I think they were ready for. So it's not to defend it. I mean, at the end of the day, it largely was using Robbie's work, and they did kind of pressure him to try to help out. But it made for sort of a muddy first date between the traditional art world and AI, in my opinion.
So, did this episode played against this type of art, or on the contrary, gave it a push?
That's a complicated question. So, I think that tremendous amount of money was spent not because people had sort of a nuanced appreciation of the work, but on the sort of the false premise that this is the first work completely made by, is the sort of the hype, right? That is why it sold for as much as it had. And as we know, things sometimes in the art market are worth a lot because they have a lot of attention, right? Not because of anything specific so this is sort of like the article I just finished for Harvard. The reason the banana with the duct tape is worth so much is because it was written about so much, right? So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it wasn't like the world got really excited and knowledgeable about the nuances of AI art as a result of this. Its value is mostly tied to the fact that it was promoted as the first AI work, sold at a major auction. Now, there is some percentage of people that maybe had never heard of this, space and this kind of work before, who maybe started from that point of just, oh, wow, a big amount of money was spent, at a known auction house, whose curiosity may have carried them further to try to understand and maybe even learn how to code, to do some coding and some training of models and to reach out to the artists and understand things a bit more. So I think it's hard to say that it helped or that it hurt. It definitely drew more attention to AI art and arguably even generative art, but it drew the attention almost under a false premise, if that makes sense. Over time, I think people, as generative art and AI art become more understood and studied, it'll just hash itself out,
Jason, I could listen to you for hours and I think we could make 10 episodes about this topic. But I'm going to jump to the last part of the show. And to try to make a transition, there's always been an opposition between man and machine. John von Neumann, in one of his first papers, described his dream of making computers as close as possible to humans or the human brain. And on the other hand, humans are willing to show that they are skilled and that what makes them human will always make them better than machines. And this leads me to a question from the audience. And Cora wants to know, how can artists working with AI or generative art bypass the stigma surrounding the supposed lack of human effort in these works?
I think through education. So as with anything, humans fear things they don't understand. The more that we can help people understand the nuance and the steps involved in creating art using AI, we can develop a new appreciation for it. So the analogy I sometimes use is when we go to a museum to see a painting, even if you're not a painter, you have a general understanding that there's a stick with some hairs on the end that you dip into pigment and you drag it around a surface. That a 5-year-old can understand intuitively right away. But when you start describing generative adversarial networks, some people's eyes roll in the back of their head and they get kind of, bored or frustrated. But so it takes a little more work for people to understand the process. But it's really, the more you understand the process and the artists and their background and all these things that make artwork rich, the more you'll appreciate the work. When I go to a museum and I see a painting, because I spent a decade, of all my time making paintings, I look at painting different than someone who's never painted before, right? I see things there, decisions and thought processes that other people may not see, and nuance. And I think that's the richness of art. It's the same for AI. I think the more people understand sort of programming and coding and how computers work and things like that, you don't have to have a deep understanding to have some level of appreciation for the work. But the deeper you go, the richer the experience, I think, will be.
And another question from our audience. Jeff would like to know, how will the use of AI affect the value of traditionally created art?
That's an interesting question. So it could be taken a few different ways. You could say, okay, if AI is producing a lot of work, cheaply, and people can go buy work that are created by AIs, does that reduce the desire for people to buy work created by a traditional artist? That would be one read of it. The other read would be that AI actually can be used to help evaluate art, right? So it could change the way we value traditional art, and that AI could be used to augment traditional appraisal systems. So that's a bit of what my article was about. I'll answer the second question first really quickly, and then I'll come back to the first part of it. So if you look at real estate, for a long time, we only ever did estimates for houses that were up for sale at the moment, and you would never have an idea of what all the other houses were worth. And then, 10, 15 years ago, things like Zillow and Redfin in the US, and I'm sure there are similar things in Europe, automated the process of coming up with prices for every house, not just the ones that are for sale. And generally in economics, when you look at price disclosure and price transparency, it actually adds liquidity to the market. So a higher volume of sales when people can actually see the prices. So using machine learning and AI, we're moving towards being able to produce a price for every artwork that ever existed, and updating those prices regularly, rather than having to only evaluate the works that are for sale using slow and expensive and manual processes. And just like with the real estate market, that could increase liquidity, and we could see a higher volume of sales, which ultimately could drive up the value, competition, and overall size of the art market if done well. And then on the first interpretation of the question, what happens if machines start producing all of these artworks? Will people just buy an artwork that came out of an algorithm and some of these algorithms can produce near infinite images, instead of buying a painting or something like that? I think to understand that question, we have to shift away from the idea of art as just being an image. I think, art is an experience, and many of the generative artists would argue that the artwork is the code. It's not any single image that comes out of it, right? And if we're thinking that generative art could replace traditional art for what I would call decoration, for the people that are literally just buying decoration, maybe, but I think that's less important. From the work that I've seen, the most exciting part of any of the AI art or the generative art, literally the most exciting part, is the human element. And the few sort of sad attempts that I've seen, mostly technologists who don't have really a training or understanding or background or appreciation in art, a lot of technologists are like, aha, I can build, an algorithm that will just automatically, because all these abstract artworks that my 5-year-old could do, like, I've always known this is dumb, and now I can use, a code to show how dumb it is and produce endless artworks, and people will just use this. Well, it's obvious to anyone who appreciates and understands and values art that there's no trace of humanity or interest in the work they're producing, right? It's just producing garbage, and we've been able to mass produce garbage for a long time, long before machine learning and AI, right? So you could have built a robot that just dropped buckets of paint, a machine that dropped buckets of paint on canvas, 500, 400 years ago, some pretty unsophisticated machines, but you still could have done it. Now, does that mean that the canvases that rolled under and had paint dropped on them are art? I mean, conceptually, maybe the person who built the machine is doing something sort of interesting, but the outputs, I guess I would leave it to your audience. If a machine mass produces images, and that's a threat to what we see as the human's traditional role in art, then maybe we need to revisit what the role of a human is in creating art. I think it's more than just making images. People think that programmatic art has no accidents because they're like, well, if you execute the program, it happens the same every single time. It's the nature of a program, right? But every single artist, and I interview a lot of generative artists and my own generative art practice, they'll tell you the only thing that keeps us going with coded art is that every time you hit go and run it, it produces things that shock and surprise us. Does that mean it's completely random and we had no control over it? No, it's like a watercolor painting, right? There are levers we can pull and buttons we can push, variables we can tweak and routines we can run and, functions we can add, that we generally know what direction it's going to go, but we still get surprised, right? And that's understanding that and experiencing that is maybe the fastest way to really grow an appreciation for generative art versus thinking it's some cold, mechanistic robot goes off and does it on its own. It's really poetic, actually, and it's no different, in my opinion, than sort of the painting process in terms of the balance between control and randomness.
Wonderful. So now the question I ask all my guests: do you have in mind an artwork that reflects today's society or the time we are currently living?
As much as I love generative art, a lot of it, at least the traditional stuff, I think is often more geometric and aesthetic. And I think the interesting aspects of it are in its creation and development of systems. But given a chance to talk about more socially what I think is going on today, I think I flip more over to the crypto art side. So, crypto art is trying to make it so that people from all around the world, without having to get into galleries, can get their work in front of people and get some recognition. And so there's an artist, Prince Jokon Osanochi from Nigeria, who grew up with very limited access to computers, where he lives in Nigeria, and with very strong social rules, anti-LGBTQ rules, and norms that are pretty conservative and aggressive and can be punished by beatings or going to jail and things like that. So against all those odds, he ended up using Microsoft Word in an internet cafe to create. No one uses Microsoft Word to make artwork, right? And he creates these beautiful, amazing artworks that are social commentaries that rail against his government and sort of the norms there, but in brilliant ways. So he's not, protest art is sort of traditionally this aggressive, angry kind of work. And his work is really, it's existence as protest, I think is how he describes it. So he's just showing these people being themselves, whether they're part of the sort of the gay community or single moms or these, doing everyday average things, being themselves, and just by getting those images out there as those being happy, well-adjusted people is making a pretty strong statement. Now, 20 years ago, he'd probably have done that and none of us would know about it. But because of the blockchain and the crypto art community, he was able, without having to ask permission, to get his work up into several markets. And folks like myself who think it's really sincere and genuine and hits the mark and really well done and unique because of his process and his tools are free to go and support him and collect the work. And I think it's a tribute to the direction that crypto art could take us. Being in art school for a lot of my life, I think sometimes folks add sort of too heavy-handed, bring in social themes into their artwork. Often when the artwork isn't very interesting, they'll try to make it feel more important by pouring on some sort of political or social statement. But I think with Osanachi's work, it's just so obvious that it's done with sincerity and bravery. And it reminds me, sometimes we make art too safe and it's too abstract and we're too distant from the human side. But it reminds me that art's greatest strength as a tool or a weapon is really around sort of revolution and change, right? And that you can do that with sincerity still, and you can do it from a place where no one thinks art's going to come from and get access to a larger world. So I know that's not one work, but I recommend folks check out all his work. He's got work showing at the Kate Bass Gallery right now. I've written about him on artnome.com. I think Osanachi might be his Twitter handle. But yeah, the work, it kind of restores my faith in the role of art to be something more than just commodified replacement for dollar bills.
Well, I think that's the best conclusion possible to our talk. Jason, thank you for enlightening us so greatly on AI and generative art. It was fascinating. I'm sure I'll call you back in a few months to dig it even further.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And if folks want to reach out, I'm very easy to access. I'm just jason at artnome.com. And then my blog is just artnome.com. So always excited to nerd out on these topics and answer any questions folks might have.
Great. Thanks again, Jason. Bye-bye.
Yep. Take care, Pierre. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Art Goes On. If you like what you heard, feel free to follow and share the show on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, or on YouTube. Leave a rating or review to help people find the show. Thanks again.